My name is Harold Whitmore. I'm 74 years old, and until recently, I believed there was one thing in life that could never be taken away from me: the bond of family. I was wrong. The moment came on an evening that should have been filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the comfort of tradition. The long oak table stretched before us, a feast laid out in warm dishes and polished silverware. Cousins, uncles, neighbors, faces I had known since they were small, leaned in close, passing plates and sharing stories. It should have been another Sunday dinner, the kind I had built my life around. But then my grandson, Ethan, stood up. 16 years old, shoulders squared, eyes set with a defiance I had never seen in him before. His voice was sharp, not trembling or uncertain, but steady in the way a knife is steady when it slices through flesh. He looked straight at me and said words I never imagined I would hear in my lifetime. "You're not family." There was no pause for reflection, no chance for me to laugh it off as a joke. His words landed heavy and cruel, echoing louder than the clatter of plates or the laughter that awkwardly tried to cover the silence that should have followed. No one defended me. No one corrected him. In that moment, surrounded by blood relatives and lifelong neighbors, I became invisible. I didn't argue. I didn't plead with him to take it back. Instead, I sat still, hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of decades crash down onto my chest. Betrayal, I realized, doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it slips into the room with just one sentence, one sharp truth or lie spoken out loud. The strange thing was, the evening didn't stop. Glasses clinked. Forks scraped against plates. A few people laughed too loudly, as if noise could drown out what had just happened. Eyes turned away from me, avoiding my face, avoiding responsibility. And in that quiet rejection, I understood something I hadn't dared to see before. My family had been preparing for this moment for a long time. It wasn't just Ethan's voice. It was Elaine's triumphant laugh at the far end of the table, Matthew's grin as he carved the roast without looking up, the way my own photographs had slowly disappeared from the walls of this house. This wasn't carelessness. It was a pattern, a deliberate erasure. Ethan's sentence was simply the final stroke of ink on a story that had already been written. And yet, even as those words burned in my chest, I kept my composure. I reached for my glass of water with steady hands, though every memory rattled inside me like a storm. I stayed silent because silence, I knew, can be sharper than argument. Silence can be preparation. That night, sitting at that table, I realized my grandson's words weren't the end of my story. They were the beginning of something else entirely. A reckoning. A reminder. And though no one in that room saw it then, they would soon learn what I had always known. You can dismiss a man, you can erase his photos, you can even laugh while he sits in the shadows, but you cannot erase the foundation he built beneath your feet. They thought those words would finish me. Instead, they sparked the fire I had been holding in silence. And before long, they would understand the truth. I was family, whether they claimed me or not. After Ethan's words cut through me like glass, I excused myself from the table. I told them I needed fresh air, though what I really needed was space. Space from the noise, from the eyes that refused to meet mine, from the silence that screamed louder than his insult. No one followed. No one even asked if I was all right. That told me everything I needed to know. I stepped into the hallway, dimly lit by sconces I had installed decades ago. The air was heavy with the smell of roasted meat and wine, but it no longer felt like home. My steps slowed as I looked at the walls. Once they were lined with photographs I had chosen myself, pictures of Margaret and me holding Matthew as a baby, snapshots of Ethan and Emily running through the yard, holidays, graduations, birthdays. It used to tell a story that began with me. But now, that story had been rewritten. The photographs hanging there were new ones. Elaine and Matthew smiling at some gala, Ethan in his football uniform raising a trophy, Emily caught mid-laugh at a summer picnic. But me? My face was absent. The frames I once hung had been replaced as though I had never existed. I was already being erased, piece by piece, long before Ethan dared to speak the words aloud. I stopped in front of the living room. Their voices floated down the hallway, muffled but unmistakable. Elaine's voice rose above the rest, sharp and triumphant. "Well, things are better now. We can host properly, finally." Her laugh followed, forced but loud enough for everyone to hear. Matthew chimed in, his agreement quick and proud. "Better now. Host properly." The words sank deep. So, I was the obstacle. My presence, my existence in this house, had been the weight they carried in shame. They weren't just indifferent. They believed I was the problem holding them back. My blood, my sacrifices, the roof I had raised above their heads, it had all become something inconvenient. I sat down in the armchair by the window, the one I had bought 20 years ago. My fingers traced the worn leather, remembering nights when I held Matthew as a child, reading him stories until he fell asleep. That boy once clung to me, once trusted me to guide him. Now his own son had declared me an outsider. The house was alive with echoes, not just of tonight, but of decades. Elaine could hang new curtains, strip away photographs, even tear out the furniture, but the walls remembered. The floors remembered. And I remembered. The cruelest betrayal is not when strangers push you aside. It's when the people you built your life around decide you're no longer worth the space you take up. And yet, in that quiet, something hardened inside me. If they thought I was invisible, they would learn otherwise. If they thought I could be erased, they had underestimated the weight of memory. Because I was more than the man sitting quietly in the corner of their lives. I was the foundation. When Emily appeared in the doorway, small and hesitant, her gentle voice cut through the storm in my chest. "Grandpa," she whispered. "I'm sorry about what Ethan said." For the first time that night, I felt something other than anger or grief. I felt seen. Her words were proof that the erasure wasn't complete. "Not yet." I smiled, though it hurt to do so. "It's not your fault, sweetheart." She shook her head, eyes filling with tears. But it wasn't true. "You are family. You're everything." And just like that, the silence that had crushed me eased slightly. For all their efforts to erase me, one voice still remembered the truth. I leaned forward and lowered my voice. Sometimes people forget where they come from. They forget who helped them stand. But forgetting doesn't change the truth. She nodded, brushing at her tears before slipping back to the dining room. I sat in the quiet after she left, realizing something important. Erasure only works if you accept it. And I wasn't ready to accept it. They could remove my photographs. They could laugh behind my back. They could even train Ethan to repeat the lies they whispered to him. But the truth is stubborn. And so am I. Tonight, they had tried to erase me. Tomorrow, they would begin to learn what happens when you erase the wrong man. That night, long after the laughter had dulled into murmurs and the clinking of silverware faded into silence, I stayed in the armchair by the window. The house creaked in familiar rhythms, but even its warmth felt foreign. Betrayal has a way of stripping the walls bare, leaving you surrounded not by a home, but by reminders of absence. I thought I was alone until a soft voice broke the quiet. "Grandpa!" Emily stood in the doorway, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She was only 15, but her eyes carried more honesty than anyone else in that house combined. She stepped into the room like she was afraid of being caught, but there was no judgment in her gaze. Just care. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "About what Ethan said." I straightened in my chair, though my chest still ached from the words that had been thrown at me hours before. I tried to smile to ease her worry. "It's not your fault, sweetheart." Her brow furrowed and her voice cracked as she replied. "But it wasn't true. You are family. You're everything." Those words struck me deeper than Ethan's ever could. Because sincerity is rare, and in a house full of people eager to erase me, Emily's quiet loyalty carried more weight than all their indifference combined. I reached forward, resting my hand gently over hers. Sometimes people forget where they come from, I told her. They forget who helped them stand. But forgetting doesn't change the truth. Her eyes brimmed with tears, though she fought to hold them back. I hate how they treat you. Hate is heavy, I said softly. Let me carry it. You just remember. She nodded, wiping her face quickly before slipping back toward the dining room, afraid to draw attention to herself. When she left, I leaned back in the chair, stunned by what her words had awoken in me. For weeks, maybe months, I had believed I was entirely alone. Matthew had turned cold, Elaine had turned cunning, and Ethan. Well, Ethan had been taught to look at me as if I was a relic, a shadow, a burden. But Emily, she still saw me. And in her loyalty, I discovered something I thought had been lost. Hope. That night, while the rest of the house carried on pretending I was invisible, Emily reminded me that my story wasn't over. She reminded me that legacy isn't measured by who sits closest at the table or who laughs loudest when the wine is poured. Legacy is measured by who remembers you when everyone else tries to forget. I stayed awake long after the house grew quiet. I thought about Ethan's cruelty, Matthew's silence, Elaine's triumph, but it was Emily's voice I carried with me into the night. Her belief that I still mattered wasn't just comfort. It was fuel. Because I understood something new. They may erase my photographs. They may strip my name from conversations. They may even scheme to take my house. But as long as Emily carried the truth, I wasn't erased. Not yet. And when the time came to remind the others of who I truly was, I knew she would be the one to understand why I fought. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. And being seen by even one person was enough to make me dangerous again. The morning after that dinner, I rose before the sun, just as I always had. Habit, discipline, call it what you will, but old rhythms die hard. I brewed a pot of coffee in the kitchen I had designed myself decades ago, back when Margaret and I imagined this house as the anchor for our family. The sunrise spilled faintly through the wide window, catching the edges of the cabinets I had chosen with care. As I sat at the table, the bitter taste of betrayal still lingered on my tongue. Ethan's words replayed in my mind. You're not family. But there was something else now, too, Emily's voice, trembling but certain. You are family. You're everything. That balance of cruelty and loyalty sharpened my thoughts. And that's when I remembered something I hadn't thought of in years. The paper. When I first built this house, I wasn't just pouring concrete and raising walls. I was building security. I wanted to make sure that what I created could never be taken lightly, never tossed aside by greed or carelessness. Margaret used to laugh at me for being so cautious. No one's going to fight you for this house, she'd said once. But I had insisted. I met with a lawyer back then, and together, we drafted clauses that were hidden deep in the deed. Clauses that tied the very bones of this place to me for as long as I lived. Paper, not noise. That was the phrase the lawyer used. People shout, people argue, but noise fades. Paper remains. I stood and walked slowly to my study upstairs. The desk was heavy oak, one I had built with my own hands. Its drawers groaned as I pulled them open, searching through layers of receipts, letters, and fading instruction manuals. And then, taped flat to the bottom, where no careless hand would ever find it, was a thick manila envelope. My fingers trembled as I peeled it loose. Not from weakness. From memory. Inside lay the deed to the house, yellowed slightly with age but still intact, still binding. I unfolded it slowly, my eyes moving across the words I had once insisted upon. The conditions were clear. As long as I was alive, no one could remove me from this home. Not legally. Not with whispers. Not even with blood ties turning sour. A slow smile spread across my face. Elaine's laughter, Matthew's silence, Ethan's cruelty, they all thought they were chiseling me out of existence. They thought they were erasing me. But they hadn't done their homework. They forgot the simplest truth. Paper remembers. I tucked the deed back into its envelope, sliding it under a stack of photo albums. No one would think to look there. Then I sat back, a calm settling over me for the first time in weeks. They believed silence meant weakness. They believed my age made me easy to discard. But what they didn't understand was that silence can be patience, restraint, strategy. When the time came, I would not need to argue at the dinner table or shout across rooms. I wouldn't need to beg for their respect. I would only need to unfold a piece of paper, place it on the table, and let the ink do what voices could not. As I closed the drawer, a thought struck me. They had underestimated me because they wanted to. They wanted to believe I was fading, fragile, forgetful. But the truth was sharper than any insult my grandson could hurl. I had built this house. I had secured it. And now, with this paper in hand, I could remind them in a way that no laughter or lies could erase. For the first time since Ethan's words had pierced me, I felt steady again. Not triumphant. Not loud. Just steady. Because while people forget, while photographs are replaced and dinners staged to erase history, paper waits. Silent. Unforgiving. And when it is finally revealed, it speaks louder than any voice in the room. A few days later, the mask began to slip. I overheard them in the dining room one morning, their voices carrying just enough to reach me as I lingered on the staircase. Elaine's tone was sharp, filled with that clipped kind of triumph people use when they believe the game is already won. "This house will look so much better once we finish," she said. "Finally, we can host properly. No more clutter. No more old shadows." Matthew's voice followed, lower, hesitant, but not defensive. "We just need to be careful. Dad's still here. He'll notice." Elaine laughed lightly, though I could hear the steel beneath it. "He won't stop us. He doesn't have the strength. Besides, Ethan's already on our side." The boy practically said it himself. "Harold isn't family anymore." My chest tightened at that. To hear my grandson's words used as proof, as ammunition, hurt worse than the moment they were spoken. They weren't treating his cruelty as a mistake. They were treating it as strategy. Later that evening, when I walked into the living room, I found Ethan sprawled across the couch, phone in hand, smirking like a prince in waiting. He didn't even glance up when I entered. Instead, he muttered just loud enough, "This place is a museum. About time Mom and Dad made it theirs." I didn't reply. I simply sat in my chair, steady, silent. But inside, every word etched itself deeper into me. They weren't just mocking me. They were claiming the house while I was still breathing. Emily, though, noticed. She lingered in the corner, pretending to read, but her eyes kept darting toward me. Later, when the others had gone upstairs, she slipped quietly into my study. "Grandpa," she whispered, closing the door behind her. "They're talking about selling the house." I looked at her carefully. "Did you hear them say that?" She nodded, her face pale but determined. "Dad was on the phone earlier. He mentioned a listing, a real estate agent." Mom was excited. Ethan just laughed. For a moment, I felt the full weight of betrayal crash down again. Selling the house, my house, the one I had built from foundation to roof, the one Margaret and I had filled with laughter and struggle and memory. They wanted to strip it away as though it were nothing more than a property, a bargaining chip. Emily's voice trembled. "What are you going to do?" I rested my hand on the desk, tracing the grain of the oak. I thought of the deed hidden just inches from where I sat, the clauses that bound this place to me. I thought of Elaine's laughter, Matthew's silence, Ethan's smirk. And then I thought of Emily, her loyalty, her courage, her quiet defiance in the face of all their noise. "I'm going to wait," I said finally. She frowned. "Wait? But—" I leaned closer, lowering my voice so she would hear the strength behind it. "They think silence means surrender. But silence can mean patience. And patience is stronger than noise." Her eyes widened slightly, and then she nodded, understanding more than a child should have to. That night, As the house settled into uneasy quiet, I sat alone in my chair once again. The walls seemed to groan, not in weakness, but in witness. They knew, as I did, that this was no longer just a home. It was a battlefield. The family was dividing itself, Elaine sharpening her ambition, Matthew drowning in his silence, Ethan flaunting his arrogance. And in the middle, Emily stood like a flicker of light in the dark. They believed that they could erase me. They believed the house was already theirs. But soon they would learn. Foundations don't crumble because you decide they should. They hold. They wait. And when the time is right, they remind everyone who built them. Sunday dinners had always been our family's ritual. Long before Elaine polished them into performances for neighbors and friends, Margaret and I hosted them simply: roast chicken, potatoes, bread fresh from the oven. The food never mattered as much as the warmth. It was where Matthew learned to cut his meat with a fork and knife, where Ethan took his first steps under that oak table. But this Sunday was different. I could feel it before I even stepped into the dining room. The air was tight, the laughter sharper, as if every smile were painted on for show. Elaine hovered at the head of the table like a queen arranging her court, her voice high and clear. Matthew lingered by the window, murmuring into his phone, words like market value and closing dates slipping from his mouth as if I wasn't even in the house. Ethan slouched in his chair, cracking jokes no one laughed at except himself. And at the far end sat Emily, her gaze flickering toward me every few seconds, her eyes filled with both worry and hope. I knew then it was time. As I took my seat, quietly at the side, not at the head where I once belonged, I let them believe I had surrendered. Let them think I was a shadow, a figure too tired to resist. I folded my hands in my lap, steady, while the meal carried on around me. Forks clinked. Glasses were raised. Elaine toasted this home as though it had sprung from her own two hands. Not once did anyone acknowledge me. Not once did anyone look my way. And that was when I reached into my jacket pocket. The manila envelope pressed against my fingers, heavy with the weight of truth. Inside was the letter I had written to every cousin, uncle, and neighbor present that night. Inside was the deed itself, stamped and sealed decades ago. Paper that remembered what voices had chosen to forget. I waited until dessert was served, when the room was loud with chatter and clinking spoons. Then I stood slowly. My chair scraped against the floor, drawing reluctant glances my way. "I won't take much of your time," I began, my voice calm but carrying. "I just have something to read." Matthew frowned, his fork pausing midair. "Dad, can this wait?" "It won't take long," I interrupted, sharper now. Elaine sighed, setting down her glass with theatrical annoyance. "Harold, really?" "Must you?" But I was already unfolding the letter. My hands did not shake. My voice did not falter. "To my family," I read, the words echoing through the room. "You may think of this house as yours now. You may eat at this table, redecorate the walls, speak of selling it, laugh at its creaks, and pretend its foundation grew from nowhere. But let me remind you, every brick, every dollar, every tree shading the yard came from me." A murmur rippled across the table. Elaine's eyes narrowed. Matthew shifted uneasily. Ethan smirked, but even his smirk faltered as the silence deepened. "For years," I continued, "I worked double shifts, saved pennies, built credit brick by brick. Not for me alone, but for this family. When you were children, this home was your playground. When you were grown, it was your refuge. And yet, in front of this very table, my own grandson told me I was not family. And none of you spoke. Not one word to defend me. Silence is agreement. And in that silence, you erased me." Ethan flushed red. He tried to laugh, muttering, "Come on, Grandpa, it was a joke." I raised a hand, cutting him off. My voice sharpened like steel. "Not family, you said." And no one disagreed. "But tonight, I will remind you of something far more powerful than words. I unfolded the second sheet, the deed, and laid it flat on the table. The room seemed to stop breathing. This house is mine. Legally. Fully. Irrevocably. Not Matthew's. Not Elaine's. Not Ethan's. Mine. Gasps filled the air. Cousins leaned in, whispering. One muttered, "It's real." His name's right there. Elaine snatched the paper, scanning it furiously. Matthew paled, rubbing his temple as though the ink itself was unbearable to look at. Ethan sat frozen, caught between disbelief and rage. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply said, "You forgot something. You forgot that I'm still here. You may erase me in words, but I remain in stone and paper, in every corner of this house. You may want me gone, but you cannot erase the truth. Not tonight. Not ever." The silence that followed was different this time, not awkward, not dismissive, but heavy. Shameful. Unavoidable. Emily's eyes glistened. She was the first to clap, just once, softly. Not in celebration, but in recognition. That single sound shifted the balance in the room. No one laughed. No one toasted. For the first time in years, they were forced to see me. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not bitterness, not victory, but presence. I was no longer invisible. The night of my revelation at the dinner table silenced them, but silence doesn't mean surrender. I knew Elaine too well. She was not the kind of woman who accepted defeat with bowed head and folded hands. No, she was the kind who sharpened her knives in the dark, plotting her next move before the applause faded. It didn't take long for their counterstrike to arrive. One morning, I found an envelope slid under the front door, crisp and official. Probate court. My son and his wife had filed a petition for guardianship, claiming I was no longer capable of managing my affairs. Concerns. The document read. Not evidence, not proof. Concerns. As if concerns could unravel decades of sweat, sacrifice, and stone. I didn't feel anger first. I felt something almost like amusement. For all their scheming, this was the best they could do. Declare me incompetent? They mistook steady silence for senility. But the sting came quickly after, because it wasn't just Elaine's hand in this. It was Matthew's. My son. My boy who had once clung to me, who had learned to walk under the roof I raised, who now stood beside his wife and declared I was unfit to live in the very house I had built for him. That betrayal weighed heavier than the summons itself. But I didn't crumble. I prepared. Harris, my lawyer, was an old friend, a man whose glasses sat low on his nose, and whose memory was as sharp as the ink on the pages he read. When I handed him the petition, he skimmed it with a grim set to his jaw. "They're going after competence," he said. "It's underhanded, but not uncommon. They'll try to paint you as confused, forgetful, unable to handle your own life." I smiled faintly. And they'll need proof, which they don't have." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "But we'll give them something better, evidence that you're sharper than they ever imagined." We set to work. I scheduled evaluations with doctors, answering every question from memory tests to dates to current events. I walked through numbers, names, and facts with clarity, watching each examiner's skepticism fade into reluctant respect. One doctor, a stern woman with an eye for details, finally set her pen down and said, "Mr. Whitmore, you're not just competent. You're precise." I'll be happy to testify to that. Each statement, each notarized document, went into my growing file of defenses. But Harris reminded me, defense alone wouldn't be enough. "Revenge doesn't need to shout," he told me, echoing my own thoughts. "But it does need to strike. If they want to drag you into court, we'll bring the truth into the light." The truth came from Emily. One evening, she crept into my study with her laptop, eyes wide but resolute. "Grandpa, you should see this." On her screen were emails, dozens of them, between Elaine and her lawyer friend, Rob. They hadn't meant for her to see them, but carelessness betrays the arrogant. The words were damning. Elaine hadn't just been plotting guardianship. She had been conspiring to seize my accounts the moment I was declared unfit. One email read, "If we can get Harold declared incompetent, we can transfer the funds without delay. Matthew will fall in line. He always does." Greed, naked and cold, written in her own hand. I added those emails to the file. Now I wasn't just defending myself. I was building a case. The day of the hearing arrived. The courthouse was colder than expected, marble floors gleaming under harsh lights. People shuffled in, clutching documents like shields. I walked slowly, cane tapping lightly against the floor, not because I needed it, but because I wanted them to see me as deliberate, steady, in control of each step. Emily walked beside me, her chin high, her presence quiet but fierce. Inside, Elaine sat with Matthew, Rob at their side. Ethan leaned back in his chair with the smug grin of a boy who thought he was already inheriting a kingdom. Elaine's eyes flicked toward me, quick and sharp before dropping back to her papers. Matthew avoided my gaze completely. The bailiff's voice rang out. Case number 4821 and guardianship of Harold Whitmore. The judge entered, a tall woman with steel gray hair and a gaze that cut sharper than any blade. "We are here to determine the petition concerning the alleged incapacity of Mr. Harold Whitmore," she said, voice firm. Her eyes landed on me, assessing. "Mr. Whitmore, are you prepared to proceed?" I stood slowly, nodding. "Yes, Your Honor." The trial began with Elaine's lawyer, painting me as frail, forgetful, incapable of paying bills or remembering names. He spoke with syrupy concern, but everyone could hear the hunger beneath it. I sat still, hands folded, letting him twist his story. Paper speaks louder than noise. Then Harris rose. His tone was calm, precise, but carried the weight of truth. "What we have here," he said, "is not concern for Mr. Whitmore's well-being. We have greed. We have manipulation. We have a calculated attempt to strip a man of his rights by those who stand to gain financially, and we have proof." He called me to the stand. The walk felt longer than it was, each tap of the cane echoing like a drumbeat. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore my oath, and sat down. Harris asked me questions, dates, names, numbers, recent events. I answered each clearly, without hesitation. The judge leaned forward, her gaze never leaving me. Then came the doctors. One by one, they testified to my competence. "Mr. Whitmore is sharp, precise, fully capable of managing his own affairs," the stern doctor declared. "There is no medical basis to suggest otherwise." Elaine's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Pages shuffled. His confidence began to crack. And then Harris played the final card. He handed the bailiff a set of printed emails, the very ones Emily had uncovered. The judge read them silently, her lips pressing into a thin line. When she looked up, her gaze skewered Elaine. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, voice cold, "how do you explain this? An email discussing how to transfer funds from an estate you do not yet control." Elaine stammered, her voice brittle. "Those were hypothetical situations, just discussions." The judge cut her off. "Hypothetical situations about seizing assets before a guardianship ruling? This court does not entertain hypotheticals built on greed." Matthew buried his face in his hands. Ethan's smirk faltered, crumbling under the weight of silence. Rob shifted uncomfortably, his slick confidence evaporating. Finally, it was my turn to speak. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Your Honor," I said softly, "I may be old. My knees may ache when I climb stairs. My hands may shake when I lift my coffee cup. But incompetence. No, what they mistake for weakness is patience. What they mistake for confusion is restraint. I built this house with sweat and sacrifice, and I will not hand it over to those who confuse entitlement with love. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, undeniable. The judge finally spoke. The petition is denied. Mr. Whitmore is competent and will retain full control of his estate. Furthermore, this court finds that the petitioners acted in bad faith. Future actions of this nature will not be tolerated. Her gavel struck, sharp and final. As people shuffled out, Elaine's face was pale, her hands trembling. Matthew avoided my eyes. Ethan muttered under his breath, but his bravado was gone. Emily squeezed my hand, whispering, "You did it, Grandpa." I looked down at her, my voice steady. "No, Emily. We did it." The courtroom victory should have been enough. For most men, it would have been the final word. Proof of competence, legal recognition, vindication in the eyes of the very people who tried to erase me. But I knew better. Elaine's silence wasn't surrender. It was plotting. Matthew's bowed head wasn't shame. It was hesitation. Ethan's scowl wasn't defeat. It was a seed of resentment waiting to grow. If I left things as they were, the war would never end. They would come again, in another way, with another scheme, each time more ruthless than the last. They believed inheritance was inevitable, that time itself would deliver them victory. What they didn't understand was that time, like paper, can be rewritten. So, I made my decision. I called Harris, my lawyer. My voice was steady, measured. "Draw up the papers," I told him. "All of it?" he asked. "All of it," I replied. "The trust, the transfers, the revisions. Everything." 2 days later, I gathered the family once more around the oak table, the same table where Ethan had declared me not family, the same table where I had revealed the deed. It was more than wood now. It was a battlefield, a witness, a silent judge of every betrayal and every truth spoken in its presence. They came reluctantly. Elaine's smile was brittle, stretched thin like glass about to crack. Matthew looked wary, his eyes darting anywhere but mine. Ethan slouched in with that same arrogance, tapping his fingers against the wood as though it already belonged to him. And Emily, my Emily, sat quietly, her eyes wide, her loyalty steady. I stood at the head of the table, papers stacked neatly in my hands. My cane rested against the chair beside me, unused. "I called you here," I began, my voice firm, "because families should not be decided in courtrooms. They should be decided in homes. Around tables like this." Elaine crossed her arms, her voice sharp. "And what exactly are we deciding today?" "The future," I said simply. I laid the top sheet on the table and slid it forward. Ethan snatched it up first, eager to gloat. But as his eyes scanned the words, his smirk dissolved. "What is this?" he muttered. Matthew leaned over, pulling the paper from his hands. His face drained of color as he read. You changed everything." Elaine snatched it next, her voice rising with disbelief. "This says we're not beneficiaries anymore." I nodded, calm. "Correct. I've moved my estate into a trust. Emily is the sole beneficiary. Every brick, every dollar, every memory goes to her." The silence shattered into chaos. Ethan slammed his hand on the table. "You can't just erase us." I looked at him evenly, my voice steady as stone. "You erased me first." Elaine's voice rose, shrill and trembling. "This is outrageous. You think you can punish us by cutting us out? You'll regret this, Harold." Matthew tried to argue, his words stumbling over themselves. But it didn't matter. Their protests were noise. The papers were signed, sealed, and legal. Paper had spoken. Emily sat frozen, her lips parted in shock. "Grandpa, I didn't ask for this." I turned to her, my eyes softening. "I know you didn't. That's why you deserve it." Her eyes glistened, torn between gratitude and fear. But beneath it all, I saw something else, pride. She understood, even if she couldn't say it out loud. This wasn't about money. It was about memory, legacy, truth. That night, long after they had stormed out in fury, the house felt different. Not quiet, not heavy, alive. Emily sat beside me at the table, her head resting on my shoulder. "They'll never forgive you," she whispered. I took a slow breath, steady. "Forgiveness isn't the point, Emily. Memory is. They will remember this night. They will remember that I was not erased, that I had the final word." The oak table gleamed faintly under the dim light, its grain warm under my hand. It had witnessed my humiliation, my defense, my reclamation. And now, it bore witness to the moment I secured my legacy. For the first time in a long while, I felt not just present, but permanent. Weeks passed after the trust was signed, and the house grew quieter than ever before. Elaine stopped speaking to me altogether. Ethan stomped around in bursts of teenage fury before retreating to his room, slamming doors like punctuation marks on his outrage. And Matthew simply disappeared into his silence. He left early, came home late, and when he did look at me, it was with eyes that seemed to search for words he could never bring himself to say. I thought that might be the end of it. Estrangement. Distance. A family divided beyond repair. But then, one morning, a letter arrived. It wasn't stamped or mailed. It was slipped under my door, the envelope trembling with the uneven strokes of a hand I knew well. My son's handwriting. I sat at the oak table and opened it carefully. "Dad," it began, "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect to be in your will or even at your table again. But I need you to know it wasn't just greed. It was fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of watching you fade and not knowing how to stop it. I was wrong. We were wrong. Ethan doesn't see it yet. And Elaine may never. But I do. If nothing else, I want to thank you for reminding me where I came from, and for reminding me that silence doesn't mean absence. Matthew." I read it once. Then again. And again. Each word was both balm and blade. The son who had betrayed me with silence now confessed with trembling honesty. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't even asking for reconciliation. He was simply asking to be heard. Emily found me sitting with the letter still in my hands. Her gentle voice broke through my thoughts. "Are you going to answer him, Grandpa?" I folded the letter slowly, sliding it back into its envelope. "Not yet," I said. She tilted her head, puzzled. "Why not?" "Because sometimes silence is the only reply that carries weight," I told her. "He needs to sit with what he wrote. He needs to feel it, not just hear my response." Emily nodded softly, understanding more than her years should have allowed. I placed the letter beside the deed, the trust papers, and all the documents that held my legacy together. But unlike those, this paper was not about law or property. It was about memory, regret, a fracture that might never fully heal. For the first time since Ethan had declared me, not family, I allowed myself to hope, just a little, that maybe Matthew still remembered the man who raised him. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window as I sat at the oak table one last time with my papers spread before me, the deed, the trust, the court rulings, and now Matthew's letter. Each document told a piece of the story, not just of my house, but of my life. Together, they formed something greater than ink on paper. They formed proof that I had lived, fought, endured. Emily entered quietly, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She set one in front of me and slid into the chair across the table. "Do you feel lighter now, Grandpa?" she asked. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the steam rise between us. "Yes," I said. "But lighter doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it just means one battle is behind you, while others wait their turn." She studied me for a moment, her young eyes filled with a wisdom I wished Matthew had never lost. "Do you regret it, cutting them out?" I let my fingers trace the grooves in the table, the very grooves left by decades of meals, laughter, fights, reconciliations. "No," I said at last. "I don't regret it. What I regretted is that it came to this. That love turned into ledgers. That blood turned into bargaining chips. Days passed in silence. Elaine and Ethan vanished into their bitterness, refusing to speak, refusing to forgive. Matthew lingered on the edges, his letter proof of guilt, but not yet of change. And I, for the first time in years, stopped waiting for their approval. I didn't need it anymore. Instead, I turned to life. Emily and I planted roses in the garden, filling the yard with blooms Margaret would have loved. I wrote letters of my own, not for court, not for lawyers, but for memory. Letters of truth, of forgiveness, of love uncorrupted. Letters I would leave behind when I was gone. And slowly, the house felt less like a battlefield and more like a home again. Not because Elaine and Matthew accepted me, but because Emily and I filled it with something they could not erase: sincerity. One Sunday morning, Emily and I walked to church together. The air carried the smell of blooming roses. Neighbors greeted me with smiles, shaking my hand, asking after my health. For years, I had been afraid of being erased, afraid of dying a ghost in my own house. But now, I saw the truth. Erasure only happens if you let it. I had written myself back into the story. Not with shouting, not with revenge, but with action, with patience, with paper. That night, I sat again at the oak table, the same table where my grandson once cut me down with his words. I placed my hand flat on the wood and whispered, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in peace. They tried to erase me, but I am still here, and I will always be here. The house groaned softly, as if exhaling with me. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel heavy. It felt alive. Family, I realized, is not who inherits your house. It's who inherits your heart. And in Emily's eyes, in her laughter in the garden we tended together, I knew I had given my heart to someone who would never erase me. And that was enough.